So thank you very much. It's lovely to be here with you all this morning. Thank you for inviting us to talk to you today. So my name is Purcell. I'm a reader in the School of Health Care Sciences here at Cardiff University, and I'm a psychologist by background. I've been working in the field of neurodivergence for far too long I can remember now. And this is Sally.
I'm Sally Scott-Roberts. I'm an occupational therapist by trade, and I've taught in higher education alongside clinical work for about 24 years, working mainly in undergrad pre-registration education for occupational therapists and other healthcare students, but also in education when I was in the University of Newport, and in postgrad studies for those already qualified and wanting to do more work around neurodivergence. Most of my clinical work now is with young people and adults who are neurodivergent. And so a lot about what I share today is what I've had the honour of learning alongside them as we work together.
Thank you very much. So we're changing tack slightly in this presentation a little bit, because we're going to talk about neurodivergence, and specifically we're going to focus on developmental coordination disorder, which is also known as dyspraxia in the UK. And the reason that we wanted to focus on that particular kind of neurodivergent presentation is because it's often the one that's least understood. Okay, so I think we felt it was quite important to focus on that. So next slide, please. So I've put a toothbrush up on the screen. I haven't got mad or I know it's Friday.
She hasn't done them today.
To remind me. So I wanted to ask you all, how many of you might want to fit. How many of you cleaned your teeth before you came here this morning?
Even if you didn't, the hand's gone up.
Absolutely brilliant. Okay, good.
The sniff test happens next.
How many of you used your dominant hand, the hand you write with, to do that? Yeah? Anybody use your non-dominant hand to do that? No. So, have you ever tried using your non-dominant hand to clean your teeth? Or to brush your hair? Yeah. How did you find it? It's really hard, yeah. It's really, really hard. And that's what, I guess, a very simple example. If you haven't tried it, I want you to try it tomorrow morning. That's your challenge. That's your homework. Okay?
Watch your gums. Watch your gums.
Put some towels around them. Tomorrow morning, if you haven't tried brushing your teeth or brushing your hair with your non-dominant hand, then that's your homework for tomorrow. It's really, really hard. And I guess that's what it feels like when you have a significant motor difficulty. And developmental coordination disorder, which is also known as dyspraxia in education in the UK, is characterised by motor difficulties. Okay, so the clue's kind of in the title. And so I'm standing in front of this. I hate standing on tables, so I'll be good.
Stand on it if you like.
So DCD is characterised by both fine and or gross motor. So that's clearly going to affect things like handwriting, writing at speed. Often what you find with children and adults with DCD is there's a speed and accuracy trade-off. So you'll find that if you ask somebody with DCD to write quickly, it's likely to be quite difficult to read. If you ask them to write accurately, then it's going to take time.
And that's the same for all motor tasks. So it's the same as you're rushing them out through the door, they're trying to do the buttons up on the coat and do their laces, and you're out through the door and you're doing them back up again because you've pushed them under speed. It's all right, there's a couple of us in here who are dyspraxic, obviously, from the nods going on. Yeah, including me.
And then things like gross motor, so that might present, so for example, crowded university corridor, high school corridor, wherever, lots of people trying to get downstairs at the same time. That's gonna create quite a lot of anxiety for somebody with significant motor difficulties, because there's a fear of falling in that kind of crowded environment. And in adulthood, it's often about the efficient, and in childhood as well, the efficient and effective use of motor skills. So what you might see is just inefficiency, not as well refined kinds of motor skills as somebody that doesn't have DCD. I think it's really important to mention that DCD is a disability. All neurodivergence is a disability. and therefore anyone with a neurodivergent presentation, or I'm trying desperately to avoid the word diagnostic label because I dislike it, but with a diagnosis, by law are protected by the Equality Act.
Can I just say at that point, and that's a dichotomy we've got for our students who go on to be diagnosed but also often want to be recognised that this is a neuro difference rather than a disability. So we've got a real dichotomy with this group of people, because they're often pulled towards the social movement of neurodivergence, but also they're entitled by law to support. So we've got this real kind of pull between the two, and I spend a lot of time talking about that with adults who are late diagnosed, or young people who are late diagnosed.
And I think that's really interesting, because there's actually now also a movement away from neurodivergence, because I think there's
I think we're the majority, to be honest.
Populations are now kind of saying, but actually we're losing our identity in terms of being ADHD or being autistic or being dyspraxic or whatever, because it's being consumed in this wider concept of neurodivergence. I think we're in a really interesting period at the moment, thinking about transitions. We're in an interesting transition period at the moment where the neurodivergence movement has been a big social movement for quite a while now. Started by Stigler back in 96, and now we're seeing a slight pushback against that, which I think is really interesting. But that's a talk for a different day. I think it's really important to also mention that approximately 6% of the population will have DCD. So you will know something. You may not know you do, but you will.
They may not know they are.
They may not know, compared to something like autism, which is 1%. There's a lot of attention around autism, rightly so, and ADHD, etc., but actually the prevalence, you're far more likely to need to know somebody with DCD. And of course, I think the other important thing is that neurodivergence doesn't, diagnostic categories are not exclusive, so it is far more likely to see overlap between diagnostic categories. So there's a 60% overlap, for example, between DCD and ADHD.
80% with dyslexia and DCD.
Yeah.
And an increasing work of research coming out looking at some of the autoimmune disorders like Dan loss and rheumatoid arthritis and the neurodivergence.
And actually things like dementia now as well. So there's lots of really interesting research coming out now looking more at across the lifespan and now into older adulthood, which is quite, the research in that area is quite in its infancy in DCD certainly. Brilliant, thank you.
Sorry.
So I've kind of set the scene here that DCD is a motor difficulty. Okay, it's people have difficulties with motor, but it isn't just about motor. And I think this is where we see a slight change in what concerns people most with DCD as they enter adulthood, young adulthood, and then adulthood. Because actually, the motor skills as an adult, we can decide what we do as adults. We don't have to play tennis. We don't have to, drive. If we
Wear a
don't want to
tie.
as adults. You don't have to do
Ride a bike.
Ride a bike.
Catch a ball.
We have a lot more autonomy. I don't want to say we have free will, but we do have a lot more autonomy about what we engage in as adults compared to children a lot of the time. So often, particularly in young adulthood and adulthood, motor difficulties are not actually often the biggest concern for people with DCD or any other neurodivergent condition. One of the commonalities across all of the kind of diagnostic categories under the umbrella of neurodivergence is actually executive functioning. And so executive functioning, which often causes, particularly adults, young adults and adults, a lot more daily challenges, things like time management, organisation and planning, understanding where you are in space, particularly for DCD. So those kind of higher order cognitive functions are often what causes the biggest challenges on a daily basis, certainly for adults with DCD, and children as well. So what that means is, you're thinking about, you've got to, when I come to work every day, I have to remember to pack my laptop nearly always, because I carry it around with me. I have to remember to pack my notebook, my pen, whatever else I need. Remembering those kinds of things can be quite, can be challenging. Remembering to bring the right things at the right time.
I was going to say, I think there is an assumption as well as you enter adulthood that we learn these things through osmosis, or we just rub next to somebody who's very organised and then it passes through. And I think a lot of the time, these things need to be taught. And we assume they enter university with those skills. And a lot of the work I do with adults is because they failed their first year. And I pick them up. I've just had a referral now come through for somebody who's just failed their first year, who's retaking their first year. And they're not going to pass the retake unless we do some teaching and some support around organisation and management, and how to timetable your life outside of the classroom, when you do your washing, when you do your cooking, and those kinds of things. Yeah.
And I think that's really important, because if you think about university, up until that point, for our younger students, our school leavers, up until that point, they've probably been living at home. They've probably, not always, but there will be a proportion of those younger students who haven't had to worry about their washing or their, etc., etc. You come or cooking and things like that. So suddenly you transition to university, and not only have you got to try and find out where you've got to be, which is often, I'm based at the Heath campus, so often very complex. But you've also got to stay on top of your washing, you've got to cook, you've got to shop, you've got to do all of these things. So going back to that kind of executive functioning, the demands suddenly increase dramatically. A lot of young adults seek a diagnosis at university, and I spoke to a student yesterday who was saying to me, "But I've always managed." It's like, yeah, but you look at the difference in what's being expected. That kind of expectation is suddenly, not just in terms of academic study, but everything else has suddenly increased. And of course, if neurodivergent individuals, and they do worry about these things, I think we'd be remiss to say that this doesn't come without some psychological impact. If they worry about it, it probably becomes 10 times worse, actually. Am I stopping there?
No. Do you want me to do this myself?
You can do this.
Okay. So in adulthood, what we found talking to people, and we did do some research about, we found that when both of us were lucky enough to work with Prof Kirby in the Discovery Centre, and we both recognised, or certainly from a clinical point of view, that we were getting lots of people coming to us with adults with a pattern, a presentation. And the efficiency and the effectiveness had almost been accepted. I'm not very good at this, it'll take me longer. So people had accepted that they were going to be efficient, effective, but alongside that, you've then got to build in the fact that it takes so much longer. There needs to be a conscious effort. So if you're consciously thinking about managing a flight of stairs when they're busy, you're not going to be able to hold a conversation. And I remember working with a gentleman who said, it has an impact on my relationship because my wife thinks I'm bloody rude. And that's because when we're walking and it's uneven, I can't answer her questions, and she just thinks I'm doing a man thing and switching off and not listening. But there were lots of issues around dual tasking that occurred because I'm still putting conscious effort into those things, particularly motor with DCD, that other people can do automatically. So although it wasn't top of their list in terms of their concerns, when you started to unpick, there was a lot of conscious effort going on. We did a study around trips, falls and bumps, and we did a comparison to peers, so we matched gender and age, and we found that significantly more of our DCD group, or neurodivergent actually, because a lot of them were co-occurring, had co-occurrences, were falling and tripping, and talked about being in A&E like it was an everyday event, talking about always having ankles strapped, choosing to adapt their life so that they didn't risk it, so always never wore heels, didn't like shiny surfaces in shopping centres because it put the fear of hate the autumn when you've got those slippery leaves, lots of the same qualitative things coming back to say, actually I've got to be wary, and of course that wariness then puts you through anxiety, you shorten your gait pattern and you're more chance of falling. So there was some really interesting findings that came out of that helped me as a therapist to look at how we support people to go forward.
Can I just add to that as well? I think it's important because we talk about I know Sam's going to pick up on this later on, but we talk about the individual, but that's an environmental thing.
Yeah.
And actually, so we need to think about actually how are we refurbishing our environments.
Our ASD environmental map markers now, we've got ASD friendly, we've got dementia friendly environments. A lot of those are really helpful for our DCD community because we don't get those big colour match transitions in carpets, for example, but it's really important for this group. The other thing is maintaining fitness. A large proportion of the young people that go into adulthood, just biologically and physiologically, are lower toned. So their tone sits at a, not abnormally, but at a lower level. So if you think your tone is here and you've got to then act, you've got to get your tone up. Unlike one of your Messi or one of the footballers whose tone is up here, ready to go. So one of the kind of presentations biologically of DCD is that a lot of this group are low toned. And you see it in the kind of sitting position. If your tone drops, your alertness drops. So if you're sitting in a chair and you've sat there for an hour listening to us, you start to see the slow down and you start to see concentration go down. So one of the difficulties is that actually you need to keep your fitness levels up, you need to keep your tone up, you need to keep your muscle strength up. But I hate sports, Sally, because PE ruined it. You know, so the whole mismatch, I find physical activity hard, I don't do it, and so I end up being less fit. So one of the things we talk to all our dragons, because we run a community group, is you've got to be fitter than your peers. Let's find a sport you can do on your own that's non-competitive, non-contact. Can we work through swimming? Can we work through the gym? A lot of our kids get real satisfaction once the gyms will let them in. So they can go and do their own programme and not being competed. The fitness levels are really important, and a lot of our adults that I come across are really unfit, and so we have that whole issue of fatigue as well as the effort. They can avoid motor-based activities such as cycling. It's a sort of in childhood it seems to be something all parents want their children to be able to do. They take longer to learn to drive. I think the best one I've had is 250 lessons. Bankrupted them over a period of 5 years, but was determined to drive. Others just opt out of it. Use of gadgets, yes, because it looks really nice as a useful gadget. Are they going to be able to learn to use it? Have mastered because of high motivation. So I've got people who are really good yachts people, and you think, how are you doing that with your motor skills? But when you're really motivated, and that's the key, you'll put the work in the practice, and it's repetition. And then found alternative ways. Often this group of young people are neurodivergent are masters at their technology because they've had to put it in place for their solutions. But saying all of that, once you've met one person with DCD, you've met one person. So we mustn't forget that this is all going to be very unique. So, Catherine.
Brilliant. So I think I just wanted to pick up on the strengths, because what we don't want to do is paint a kind of an unfair negative picture of people with neurodivergence, because that absolutely is not the case. And people with neurodivergence and in this instance, particularly DCD, have a massive number of strengths. And I think that's where we need to work at. You know, we need to be nurturing those strengths, understanding those strengths, building on those strengths. Neurodivergent young people during education will often have spent a lot of their time in education being told that they can't, they're not very good at something. They know that. They don't need people telling them that. So by the time they get to transition to university, it's about actually thinking about the student I was speaking to yesterday. You know, how have you got this? You know, you're obviously very bright. You've got to university. How have you done that? Let's look at those strategies you've clearly adopted. Let's look at the strengths you have and build on those. So they're often very good at problem solving because they kind of have to be. Often very creative, thinking outside the box. Very good at picking up on when other people are struggling, and usually very empathetic and happy to help. Typically very non-competitive, actually. And really persistent and hard-working because they've had to be all their lives. So these are people, you know, that you really want around, because they are, you know, they have a huge. This is just a very short list. We could have gone on for hours about this, but yeah.
Okay, so thinking about transition, and I guess as an occupational therapist, I tend to work with people when they're in transition. I tend to work when people are in that liminal space between what was and what needs to be next. And I don't get involved unless they're stuck. So I use the bridge analogy a lot. There is a model actually called the Bridges model, but I use the bridge analogy quite a lot because when we're talking to young people who are neurodivergent, we talk about them just needing a little bit of support to build that bridge. Sometimes it takes years, sometimes it might take one session, and it's enough to get them to bridge across. But traditionally, when students enter university, they are in that liminal space. I think I'm not a linguist, but the Latin word means on a precipice. So they are on that precipice of needing to change, to live a different life, and yet there may not be anything there to support them to bridge that across. And the unfortunate part about university, particularly undergrad, it is constant transition. So they get used to level 4, and then you make them do level 5, and then we make them do level 6, and then, oh Lord, we do level 7 if you're lucky enough or can stand it, going on to do level 7. Oh, you talk to a level 6 student, they never want to go in education again, usually. So it is a significant transition. It's a huge life event. It should go down with divorce, moving house, moving jobs, because it's got to be one of the biggest stresses for all students. And it's a period of adaptation of what was to what is next. It's uncomfortable. It's meant to be uncomfortable. If we have a period of growth, because the positive of this is a period of growth for transformation, it needs to be uncomfortable. It's just like we say to our students, when you're writing an academic piece, you have to go through the muddle to come out the other end. That is normal. If you're sat there going, I don't know, it's going right in my head, that's perfectly normal. This is normal, and I think for me, some of the work I do is around normalising it. That everybody, I'm not saying that it's hard for you, but this is normal and you need to expect confusion and chaos. For neurodivergent students, this is a massive period of adaptation, and they take longer to adapt because of whatever their major characteristic is. If it's movement, you've suddenly got whole new spatial environments to deal with. You've got new skills and tasks to learn. If you're somebody that likes structure and routine because you've got hyper-focus, you've got very black and white ways of thinking, then now suddenly this is all up in the air and very, very grey. So this period of adaptation is going to take longer for these people. And you'll just about see adaptation happening and you've moved on. You know, so this guy that I'm picking up, I'm sure, has got to the end of level 4 and has just about worked out what the dickens he's supposed to do, and he's been told he's failed academically. Not because he's not academically capable, but he's had to deal with everything else. If planning, motor, spatial and orientation skills have got to be done at a conscious level, we're in trouble, because you've now got to deal with all of that, plus listen to what your lecturers are saying and get ready for academic. And this leads to heightened fatigue and anxiety. And often that's what people are referred for, is the anxiety and the fatigue. And I'm sure our mental health services are seeing a lot of our neurodivergent students and dealing with what is visible rather than what potentially is going on underneath. As an occupational therapist, we always look at the transaction between the person, environment and activity. You can't contextualise them. So we've said the environment's different, the activities expected are different. So skills they'd mastered before are now not working. And that is so demoralising for people, because they say, I could do this and now I can't. But you have to help them see that actually the environment is massively changed an activity. And that doesn't matter whether you're a student moving away from home or most of my students are mature students who are suddenly trying to negotiate working and families on top of this. So protective factors from the research and from talking to people have been these things. Something remains stable. We have a support line with Dragons, and I get phone calls in the summer holidays from parents saying my child is going to university, and I'm always a little bit when they say they're moving away from home and they're going to university. My recommendation will always be that at least for that first year, keep something stable. We know from the research, in periods of transition, you have to have some element of stability. Your youngsters coming here have lost any stability. So that's not surprising then they find it really difficult. A network of support, belonging and connectedness is essential. We now know isolation kills. We've got the research. So we need to ensure that we've got those networks of support. And of course then our vulnerable students who are carers, come from families that perhaps are not supported, and use even that little network that they could ring up and talk to somebody. Preparation is the more preparation we do before people come, so they can anticipate, they can see, they can look around the environment, they've got a virtual orientation, they can, what the Discovery Centre does in terms of Discovery programme does, brings them in and they can live in accommodation, is all essential, I think, for all students, but for neurodivergent students necessary. Meaning, how many of our students come because their parents thought it was a good idea? You know, interviewing students whose retention is poor is often because it wasn't something that was their decision. I had a guy that failed his first year, and when I asked him why he was doing the course he was doing, he said, I don't know, my mum thought it was a good idea, I want to be a police officer. He was never ever going to be able to commit the amount of work he needed to do to be successful if it wasn't meaningful to him. Choice and control links to that. Transition objects. We see our children drag our teddies around. I'm going to admit, he still goes everywhere with me. You know, we have lucky pants, lucky socks. We all have our own transition objects, but what can people bring with them that brings a sense of home, brings a sense of something they know, a talisman? Comfortable with the muddle? How do we prepare our young people to accept that muddle and chaos is okay when we live in a world where there's an answer straight at the end of a text? So we need to help them work with chaos, and perhaps that's around doing more activities where there is a muddle to work through. Support with more than just academic work. I do a lot of timetabling on and teaching how to do things like online shopping. One of my OT students has just designed some really nice videos on how to use the washing machine pitched at university students, that her mother was the guide on it, because it's much better coming from granny than it is from mother. And there's support established structures and routines. Other things, technology, safe pace, safe person, establishing with somebody you're working with that you know is struggling, who is your safe person that you can go to, where's your safe place? Because when we're seeking equilibrium in chaos, we either run or we stand and fight. So what are we going to, we don't want to run because that's where our retention issues come in. So who can they run to? Where's the safe place they can run to? Okay. Identification of coping strategies. You know, what do they do in their downtime? Have they managed to balance? Are they working to early hours of the night because they have to read a paper 4 times when everybody else reads it once? Is there no technology that can interpret that flipping paper? Surely now with AI there must be. So how do we help them look at getting that balance between what they need put in their academic and what they get with their downtime? Maintaining fitness levels, teaching domestic skills. We ran about 8-9 years ago a project out of OT where we took students that were coming into university and taught them domestic skills, like how to use a knife. Parents, rightfully, to get them through school, which is enough of a struggle, wrap them up in cotton wool, don't teach them the basic skills. And so what happens is they come and they can't use a knife. I've never been allowed to use a knife, don't know how to do certain things, don't know how to read a timetable for a bus, those kinds of things. And timetable in free study time. Being able to advocate for the needs. This is one thing that we promise through Dragons, is that we support our young people to always be able to advocate for what they need. They need to be able to speak up. And often in a solution-focused way, people don't bark at you if you go in with a solution. This is what works for me. Is that okay with you? Rather than that. So advocating for their needs. And then activities. We learn connectedness through doing. This was a project, a co-designed project we did back 2019. Yeah, and less grey. With a group of adults with DCD, we sourced some funding from the Richard Benjamin Trust to run a residential set of workshops. They were the authors of these, and this is a set of guides to success. If any of you are interested, there is a QR code that you can access it from. They're verbatim suggestions and strategies that have come from people. All we did was facilitate the discussion and help them theme those topics. Thank you very much, Jill.